You know the postcard. The water goes from glass to turquoise to a blue that doesn't look real. A volcano smokes quietly in the background like it's not the most dangerous thing on the island. Someone is holding a pineapple. Somewhere off camera there's a ukulele. That image has been sold to the rest of the world for so long that most people could not point to a single real place in Hawaii, only the postcard. Now forget the postcard for a second, because in the middle of Oahu, wedged behind a ridge that tourists drive past on the way to Pearl Harbor, there is a mountain that isn't just a mountain. For over 50 years, the United States government did not put it on public maps. It didn't show up in briefings to the people who lived a few hundred feet above it. It had a name that sounded like nothing, Red Hill, and inside it sat 20 steel tanks, each one tall enough to swallow a 15-story building, holding enough jet fuel to fill more than 300 Olympic swimming pools. People lived, worked, and raised kids directly on top of it for decades without being told what it was. That's the fracture. The postcard says paradise. The mountain says something else. And once you know the mountain is there, the question becomes obvious. What else is Hawaii not showing you? That question isn't new. If you spend any time in the corners of the internet where people trade Hawaii theories, you'll find the same claim repeated in different shapes. Hawaii is hiding something. Sometimes it's about a private island nobody can visit. Sometimes it's about a bombed-out island the government still won't let you set foot on without a permit. Sometimes it's vaguer than that. Just a feeling that the state everyone associates with Mai Tais and honeymoons has a locked door somewhere, and nobody wants to say what's behind it. Before testing the human explanations, it's worth ruling out the natural one, because plenty of people assume the secret is geological. Something about the volcanoes the government supposedly isn't telling you. That one falls apart fast. Kilauea is one of the most closely watched volcanoes on the planet. The Hawaiian Volcano Observatory runs more than 100 field stations that track earthquakes, ground swelling, gas output, and lava movement in something close to real time. And almost all of that data is public. Anyone can pull up current seismicity, deformation charts, and eruption updates the same day scientists see them. Hawaii's volcanoes are some of the most transparently monitored natural hazards in the country. Whatever is being kept from the public, it has nothing to do with lava. Most of that talk traces back to two real places, not rumors: Niihau and Kahulawe. Both of them are fully closed to the public. Both of them have fed decades of speculation. And both of them, when you actually test the claims against the record, turn out to have explanations that are stranger, sadder, and more human than any conspiracy theory. Then there's a third place almost nobody brings up in the same breath, and that third place is where the real story is. So let's test this properly. Claim, source, alternative explanation, and the limit of what we actually know. Start with Niihau, because it's the one people reach for first. It's called the Forbidden Island, and that nickname alone has done more work spreading rumors than any actual policy the island has. The claim goes something like this: the government is hiding something on Niihau, maybe a military project, maybe something related to Pearl Harbor's defenses, maybe just a piece of Hawaii kept off limits because someone in power wants it that way. Here's what actually happened. In 1864, a Scottish widow named Elizabeth Sinclair bought the island from King Kamehameha IV for $10,000 in gold. She wasn't buying a secret. She was buying grazing land for cattle and sheep. The family asked the king what they should do if the island's value ever became a burden to the people living there. And according to the family's own account, he told them to preserve the island and its people the way they were. That promise, whether you take it as sincere or convenient, became the operating principle for 4 generations. The Robinson family, Sinclair's descendants, still owns Niihau today. It is private land, plain and simple, in the same legal category as someone owning a ranch in Wyoming and telling strangers they can't wander onto it. What makes it different is scale and intent. The family has kept the island without paved roads, without a hotel, without commercial development, and largely without electricity from a public grid. Around 80 to 90 native Hawaiian residents live there, and Hawaiian remains the first language spoken at home. Not a heritage exhibit trotted out for visitors, but the actual language of daily life. Access is by invitation only, and outsiders, including people from other Hawaiian islands, generally don't get in without a specific reason and the family's permission. Niihau's isolation isn't only a modern policy either. In December 1941, days after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese fighter pilot named Shigenori Nishikaichi crash-landed his damaged plane on the island. Japanese command had actually picked Niihau in advance as a rescue point for damaged aircraft, believing it was uninhabited. It wasn't. The residents treated him cautiously at first, even hospitably, until word of the attack reached them, at which point they disarmed and held him themselves, days before any outside military authority arrived to help. It's one of the stranger footnotes of the Pacific War, and it says something true about the island's whole relationship with the outside world. Whatever happens on Niihau tends to get handled on Niihau, by the people who live there, without waiting for permission from anywhere else. So test the claim against the evidence. Is there a hidden government project on Niihau? No credible source has ever produced one, and a truly secret facility doesn't usually survive 160 years of private family ownership, deeded property, and public property records anyone can pull. Is there a natural explanation, some geological hazard making the island unsafe to visit? Also no, Niihau isn't dangerous. It's dry, it's small, and its biggest natural feature is a lake that occasionally floods. The real explanation is the boring one that never trends. A family made a private choice, backed by legal ownership, and has held to it for longer than most countries have held to their constitutions. The restriction is real. Limiting outside contact has arguably protected a native Hawaiian community and its language in a way that almost nowhere else in the state managed to do, because everywhere access was opened. The language and the land use changed fast. Niihau tests as prohibition that resolved into something closer to legitimacy, even if you can debate whether one family should hold that kind of control over 80 people's lives. That's a fair conversation. It's just not a conspiracy. Now the second island, and this one is heavier. Kahoolawe sits just southwest of Maui, small, dry, and for most of the 20th century, on fire. The claim here isn't that something is being hidden exactly. It's closer to a question people ask when they see the warning signs on the shoreline. Why can't I go there? And why does it still look wrecked from the air? The short answer is unexploded bombs. The long answer is worse. Before any of that, Kahoolawe was Kohemalama o Kanaloa, dedicated to Kanaloa, the god of the ocean and deep-sea voyaging. Navigators trained there for centuries, reading stars, currents, and weather before setting out for Tahiti along a channel still called Kealaikahiki, the pathway to Tahiti. Archaeologists have since documented more than 3,000 cultural sites on the island, including the largest stone adze quarry in Hawaii. This was never empty land waiting for a use. It was a working, sacred place with its own long history before anyone in a uniform set foot on it. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the military declared martial law across the territory and needed a place to practice. Kahoolawe, already home to native Hawaiian cultural sites, fishing grounds, and burial areas, became a bombing range. Ships fired shells at it from offshore. Aircraft dropped live ordnance on it. Submarines tested torpedoes against its cliffs. In 1965, the Navy detonated 500 tons of TNT on the island in a series of tests, codenamed Sailor Hat, designed to simulate what a nuclear blast would do to a warship's systems. The shock waves were measured as far away as other islands. This went on, with breaks, for close to 50 years. 50 years of a sacred island being used as a live target, without the consent of the native Hawaiian community it belonged to. On January 4th, 1976, 9 activists who came to be known as the Kahoolawe Nine deliberately landed on the island in defiance of the military, launching what became the Protect Kahoolawe Ohana movement. More landings and occupations followed. 2 of the movement's members, George Helm and Kimo Mitchell, disappeared at sea during one of those protest voyages in 1977 and were never found. Their deaths became a turning point in the fight to reclaim the island, and this year marks 50 years since that first landing, an anniversary Hawaii has been actively commemorating. It worked, eventually. President George H.W. Bush ordered an end to the bombing in 1990. Congress transferred the island back to the state of Hawaii in 1994, along with roughly $400 million for cleanup. And this is where the story stops being simple, because the cleanup never finished. Crews cleared more than 9 million pounds of unexploded ordnance and metal debris from the island, working with metal detectors across terrain littered with bombs ranging from 2 pounds to 3,000 pounds, including napalm and fuel-air explosives that don't always announce themselves the way a rusted artillery shell does. Even with all that effort and all that money, only about 3/4 of the surface and less than 1/10 of the subsurface were ever confirmed clear. That's why you still need authorization from the Kahoolawe Island Reserve Commission to set foot there, and why most people who do go are part of organized cultural, educational, or restoration trips rather than tourists with a rental car. The commission is now working on a rock-lined perimeter trail called the Ala Loa, built along sections of coastline already cleared of ordnance, meant to open new landing sites over the next several years and slowly widen access without pretending the danger is gone. The restriction is a live safety hazard sitting under an island that the government spent 50 years treating as disposable. Test the claim. Is Kahoolawe closed because someone is hiding something from you? In a sense, yes. But what's hidden isn't a secret, it's a scar. And the scar is the whole reason for the fence. This one doesn't resolve as cleanly as Niihau. It's prohibition that started as abuse, a sacred place bombed without consent for half a century, and only turned into something like legitimate protection after native Hawaiians forced the change themselves, at real cost. Niihau and Kahoolawe aren't even the only restricted ground in the islands, just the 2 people talk about. Over on Kauai's west side sits the Pacific Missile Range Facility, a testing site so large it manages over 1,000 square miles of instrumented ocean and more than 40,000 square miles of controlled airspace used for missile defense tests. The public sometimes sees as strange lights in the night sky without ever being told what caused them. On the Big Island, Pohakuloa Training Area is the largest live fire training ground in the Pacific, sitting across land many native Hawaiians consider sacred, with leases that have become a genuine, ongoing political fight over who controls that ground going forward. Both of those are real restricted zones, both are defended on security grounds, and both are currently contested by the communities whose land they sit on. Neither one, though, is hiding a health disaster from the people living nearby. That distinction matters because it's exactly the line the next case crosses. 2 islands, 2 different verdicts, and neither one is the internet's favorite secret government facility. So where does that leave the myth? If the popular claim that Hawaii is hiding something nobody talks about is going to survive contact with evidence, it needs a case that actually behaves like a cover-up. It needs a case built in secret, kept secret past the point of reason, and only exposed because it started hurting people badly enough that hiding it stopped being possible. That case exists. Almost nobody outside Hawaii and the military knew about it until it was already a crisis. It's called Red Hill, and it sits directly underneath tens of thousands of people on Oahu, not offshore, not on a private island, but under homes, schools, and a good chunk of the water that comes out of the tap in Honolulu. Here's where it starts. In the late 1930s, with war against Japan looking more likely by the month, the Navy realized that its above-ground fuel tanks around Pearl Harbor were sitting ducks. A single air raid could destroy the fuel supply for the entire Pacific Fleet in one pass, so the Navy decided to bury the problem, literally. Construction began in December 1940 inside a ridge called Kapukaki by native Hawaiians, later renamed Red Hill. Engineers carved 20 enormous vertical tanks directly out of solid volcanic rock, each one about 20 stories tall, each one holding around 12.5 million gallons of fuel, all of it buried under about 100 feet of rock above the tank domes. The project finished in 1943. It remains one of the largest underground construction projects ever completed in the United States. And for decades, almost nobody outside the military knew the details of how it was built, because the records describing it stayed classified until 1995. That's not a rumor. That's the government's own declassification timeline. A facility holding up to 250 million gallons of fuel, sitting above the drinking water for an entire island, was kept officially secret for more than 50 years. For most of that time, the secrecy didn't cause an obvious problem, or at least not one the public could see. Small leaks happened periodically, the way they do at any large industrial fuel site, and were handled quietly, reported internally, addressed without public notice. That pattern held until it couldn't anymore. On May 6, 2021, a pressure surge inside the facility caused a pipe joint to fail, releasing more than 19,000 gallons of jet fuel onto a tunnel floor. Instead of spreading immediately, the fuel drained into a fire suppression system's containment line and sat there, essentially trapped, for months. On November 20th of that same year, that drain line ruptured, and the fuel that had been sitting there moved toward a well called the Red Hill Shaft, one of the wells supplying drinking water to military housing nearby. Within about a week, residents of Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam and nearby military housing started reporting something was wrong with their tap water. It smelled like fuel. It looked strange coming out of the faucet. People described headaches, nausea, vomiting, rashes, and dizziness in kids as well as adults. The Navy's initial public position was that the drinking water was safe. That statement did not match what residents were experiencing in their own kitchens and bathrooms, and it did not match what internal reports would later confirm. An official notice about the fuel release was not issued within 24 hours of the Navy learning about it, the kind of delay that turns an accident into something closer to a cover-up, even if nobody ever proves it was planned that way. By the time the scale of the contamination was acknowledged, roughly 93,000 people had been affected across the water system tied to the facility, and military medical teams treated around 6,000 of them for fuel-related symptoms. Families were displaced from base housing for months, while the system was flushed and tested. This wasn't a rumor whispered on a forum. It was documented by the Hawaii Department of Health, investigated by the Environmental Protection Agency, and covered, eventually, by national outlets once it became too large to keep local. So why did this happen? Mechanically, and not just administratively. This is where the geology actually matters, because it's the difference between folklore and cause. Oahu's fresh water doesn't come from rivers or reservoirs the way it does in a lot of the mainland United States. It comes from a single enormous underground aquifer sitting inside porous volcanic basalt rock, the same kind of rock the Red Hill tanks are carved into. That aquifer is the sole source of drinking water for most of the island, producing on the order of 87 million gallons a day, drawn from a system with a sustainable yield estimated around 165 million gallons a day. There's no backup river system to switch to if it's compromised. Basalt rock is porous. It moves water efficiently, which is exactly why it makes a good aquifer, but that same property means it can also move contaminants efficiently if something leaks into it. The Red Hill tanks are old, single-walled steel, built in the 1940s with the engineering standards of that era, not the double-hulled, continuously monitored standards you'd expect from a modern facility. A third-party assessment ordered after the 2021 crisis found corroded piping, damaged protective coatings, missing structural bracing, and degraded pier structures throughout the facility. That's just what happens when you bury steel tanks holding fuel for 80 years inside rock that sits directly above the only water supply an island has, and defers serious maintenance long enough. The mechanism isn't mysterious. It's corrosion meeting porous rock meeting a single point of failure for drinking water, sitting under a secrecy classification that outlived the reason for it by decades. What happened after the crisis is where you can actually test whether the system fixed itself or just managed the fallout. In May 2022, Hawaii's Department of Health issued an emergency order requiring the Navy to defuel the tanks and submit a timeline. There was resistance and delay at first, disputes over methods and schedules, before the Department of Defense committed to a firm closure plan. Actual defueling operations began in October 2023, after months of pipe repairs meant to keep the aging system from failing again mid-drain. By the time it was done in 2024, crews had removed the remaining fuel, more than 100 million gallons of it, from a facility that had operated for 80 years. That sounds like an ending. It isn't quite one. And this is the part worth being precise about instead of tying a bow on it. Defueling the tanks doesn't undo the plume of contamination that already moved into the ground and rock beneath the facility. In early 2024, the Environmental Protection Agency identified widespread PFAS contamination, sometimes called forever chemicals, in the soil and groundwater around the site, a separate and longer-lived problem from the jet fuel itself. Later that year, the Honolulu Board of Water Supply detected new traces of oil in a different shaft, the Aiea shaft, meaning contamination that started at Red Hill had continued moving through the aquifer system well after the headline crisis had faded from national news. As of the most recent monitoring reports, drinking water tested by the Board of Water Supply has not shown PFAS levels above current federal limits, but testing is ongoing. Additional monitoring wells are still being added, and the models used to predict how contaminants move through that basalt rock are still being refined, not finished. There's also the question of what happened to the people, separate from what happened to the water, and that part is still working its way through court as this is being written. More than 6,500 claims were eventually filed against the federal government over the contamination. As of last year, roughly 3,600 of those had reached settlements, with individual payouts that plenty of the families involved consider too small to match what they went through. One early trial awarded 17 families a combined total of about $680,000, individual amounts ranging from $5,000 for the youngest plaintiffs up to $75,000 for the teenagers among them. A later round distributed $17 million across roughly 630 plaintiffs, a little over $27,000 each. Some families have taken the settlements. Others, including parents suing on behalf of their kids, have turned them down and are choosing to go to trial instead, arguing that a number calculated by a formula doesn't capture what it's like to have bathed your infant in water that turned out to be carrying jet fuel. That fight is still ongoing. It is not a closed case. That's the honest edge of this story, and it deserves to be stated exactly as it is, not rounded up or down. We know what was hidden. We know why it was built in secret. We know when the classification lifted. We know the mechanics of the leak, the delay in warning people, the geology that turned a maintenance failure into a public health crisis. And we know the fuel itself is now out of the tanks. That part isn't a mystery anymore. Isn't a mystery. What's still unresolved is smaller but real. The full extent of the underground plume. How far the PFAS contamination has traveled through rock that nobody can see into directly, and what the long-term health outcomes will look like for thousands of people who drank that water for weeks before anyone told them to stop. Those aren't questions a documentary can answer for you because the scientists studying the aquifer don't have the answers yet either. So back to the original claim. Is Hawaii hiding something nobody talks about? Not in the way the internet usually means it. Not some singular vault or forbidden zone with a story everyone's too scared to tell. What's actually there is a pattern, repeated across 3 very different places for 3 very different reasons. A family kept an island closed for 160 years to protect a culture. And it worked, mostly. A government bombed a sacred island for 50 years without consent, got forced to stop by the people who belonged to it, and handed back land it still hasn't finished making safe. And a military branch buried a fuel facility so effectively that the people living directly above it didn't know what was under their feet until it made them sick, then spent 2 more years managing the story before finally draining it. The postcard never showed any of this, and all of it is still Hawaii. The turquoise water is real. The volcano is real. So is the ridge nobody put on the tourist map, and so is the difference between an island that closed its doors to protect its own people and a mountain that got hollowed out and hidden mostly to protect an institution. That's the boundary worth remembering the next time someone tells you paradise doesn't have secrets. It has plenty. Some of them turned out to be someone protecting a home. At least one of them turned out to be someone protecting themselves. If this changed the way you'll look at that next Hawaii postcard, that's kind of the point of doing one of these properly, testing the claim instead of just repeating it. Let me know in the comments which of the 3 surprised you most, Niihau, Kahului, or Red Hill, because I want to know which one people didn't already have on their radar. Hit like if this kind of claim testing is what you come here for, and subscribe so you catch the next island story that gets the same treatment.